The hotel lobby went quiet when the man in the gas station uniform pushed the envelope back across the marble counter. "You think I drove 40 miles in the middle of the night just to trade that for cash?" The envelope held $5,000. Vivian Sinclair had counted it herself. Crisp, clean, a fair price for a good deed or so, she thought. The wallet sat between them on the surface. Inside, close to $6,000 in cash, a no-limit black card, and a photograph so old and so private that she hadn't shown it to a single person in over 10 years. Owen Carter was a single father drowning in debt. He needed that money more than anyone she had ever met. But the look in his eyes made her realize for the first time that not every person in this world could be bought. Vivian Sinclair did not take road trips. She had a driver, a private car service on speed dial, and a calendar so tightly packed that spontaneous travel was essentially a foreign concept. But once a year, without telling anyone on her team, she got behind the wheel of a rented sedan and drove south from Chicago alone. No assistant, no security, no phone calls answered. Just 4 hours of highway and the particular kind of silence that only existed when no one needed anything from her. The drive to Tennessee was something she had done every year since her mother died. She never explained it to anyone because no one had ever asked in a way that deserved an honest answer. It was not a ritual she was proud of. It was simply a thing she could not stop doing, the way some people kept a voicemail they couldn't bring themselves to delete. She drove down, visited the grave, sat for a while, and drove back. That was all. That had always been all. It was nearly midnight when she pulled off the highway just outside a small town whose name she had already forgotten. The gas gauge had been sitting below a quarter tank for the last 20 miles, which was the kind of careless mistake she would have fired an assistant for making. She pulled into the first station. She saw a tired-looking place with flickering fluorescent lights and a hand-painted sign above the door that someone had clearly repainted at least twice without ever correcting the original spelling error. The lot was almost empty. The only other vehicle was a rusted sedan with a cracked taillight parked near the side of the building, the kind of car that belonged to whoever was working inside. She filled the tank herself, which she always did on these trips, because doing ordinary things with her own hands was the closest she came to feeling like a normal person anymore. Then she went inside to pay, moving quickly through the snack aisle without really looking at anything, and set her wallet on the counter while she reached into her coat pocket for her phone. The man behind the counter rang up her items without ceremony. She signed, took her receipt, and walked back out into the cold. She was 40 minutes down the highway before she realized the wallet wasn't in her bag. Owen Carter was halfway through his overnight shift when the woman in the expensive coat came through his door. He noticed her the way he noticed most things at that hour, without much feeling attached to it, the way a person gets when they've worked nights long enough that everything blurs into the same flat sequence of strangers passing through. She bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers. She paid quickly and left without making eye contact, which was not unusual. A lot of people who stopped at highway stations after 11 at night didn't want to be looked at. He understood that. He didn't find the wallet until after she was gone, after he'd wiped down the counter and restocked the rack of maps near the door that nobody ever bought. It had slipped behind the small plastic organizer where he kept the store's pens half hidden against the back wall of the counter. He almost missed it. He almost didn't pick it up because he assumed it was one of the cheap nylon billfolds people left behind every few weeks, usually empty, usually belonging to someone who had already replaced everything inside and wouldn't bother coming back. But it was heavy, and it was not cheap. He set it on the counter and opened it the way he would have opened anything belonging to someone else, carefully with both hands, touching as little as possible. The cash was there immediately, a thick fold of bills held together with a silver clip. He counted it this time because he needed to know exactly what he was looking at. $5,800. Behind the cash was the black card, no logo he recognized, no visible credit limit. And behind that, slipped into the small photograph sleeve that most people left empty, was a picture. Old. Worn at the edges. A woman in her mid-30s, and a girl standing somewhere sunny, both of them squinting against the light. The woman had her arm around the girl's shoulder. Neither of them was looking at the camera. They were looking at each other. Owen looked at the photo for a moment longer than was necessary, then closed the wallet and set it under the counter. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He thought about this with the kind of detached logic he had developed over years of making decisions from a narrow set of bad options. The wallet had been left behind. He would turn it into his manager in the morning. That was policy. That was the right thing to do. He went back to his inventory count and got through the next hour without thinking about it much. Then he started thinking about the cash, not in the way he was ashamed of, not the impulse that arrives and leaves quickly like a bad smell. It settled in slowly, the way real temptation does, dressed in reasonable clothing. He thought about the number of months he was behind on rent. He thought about the medical debt that had been accumulating since his wife died 3 years ago, a slow paper avalanche of bills that arrived regularly and were mostly going unanswered. He thought about the notice he had received last week, that his car insurance would lapse in 11 days if he didn't bring the account current. Without the car, he couldn't get to work. Without work, there was nothing. The math of his life had a way of reducing itself to that single brutal point every time he tried to think past it. The woman in the expensive coat would not notice $5,800 the way he would notice $5,800. That much was obvious. But Owen had a rule he had carried for a long time, not because it had ever made his life easier, but because it was the only thing he had been consistent about. He did not take what wasn't his. He had told himself this enough times that it no longer felt like a moral position. It felt more like a bone, something structural that he couldn't remove without collapsing the rest of the thing. He looked up the hotel nearest to the highway exit on his phone. There was only one within a reasonable distance. He finished his shift, clocked out at 6 in the morning, and then drove 40 miles north instead of going home. The hotel lobby at 7 in the morning had the particular stillness of a place that had just exhaled. The night staff was wrapping up. A few guests were already moving through with roller bags and coffee cups. Vivian Sinclair was sitting in one of the chairs near the window when Owen walked in, and she looked like a woman who had not slept and was not planning to admit it. She had already reported the wallet missing to the front desk. She had already called to freeze 2 of her cards. She was working through the mental list of everything she would need to replace when the man in the gas station uniform walked through the glass doors and asked the woman at the front desk if a guest had reported losing a wallet. Vivian crossed the lobby in 15 seconds. She said very little at first. She took the wallet and checked it in the way she checked everything fast, thorough, clinical, and then she looked up at Owen with an expression that he couldn't entirely read. Not grateful exactly. Or not only grateful. Something more careful than that. She thanked him briefly, and then she went to the front desk and asked for an envelope. She came back with $5,000 in cash and held it out to him. Owen looked at the envelope. Then he looked at her. He could see the logic of the gesture from where she was standing. It was reasonable. It was proportional. It was the kind of thing a person with resources did when they wanted to close a transaction cleanly. He understood that she wasn't trying to insult him, but understanding the logic of something had never made it feel less wrong. He pushed the envelope back across the counter. "You think I drove 40 miles in the middle of the night just to trade that for cash?" Vivian Sinclair had been in rooms with some of the most calculated people in American business. She had sat across from men who smiled while lying, women who wept strategically, partners who shook her hand and sued her 6 months later. She believed with the kind of conviction that comes from enough evidence that every person who came close to her wanted something. Money, access, proximity to the name. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had, in fact, built her entire way of moving through the world around this assumption because it had never once been wrong. Owen picked up his keys from the counter. He told her he hoped she made it home safely. Then he walked back out through the glass doors and got into his car. Vivian stood in the hotel lobby, holding an envelope with $5,000 in it. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she had no idea what had just happened. She sat back down in the chair by the window and watched his car pull out of the lot, the rusted sedan with the cracked taillight, the same one she had noticed parked at the side of the station the night before. She watched it until it turned onto the highway and disappeared, and then she sat with the envelope in her lap and tried to locate the feeling that was sitting in the center of her chest. It wasn't guilt. She had offered him a fair amount of money. She hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't embarrassment exactly either, though there was something adjacent to that. The specific discomfort of having offered something you assumed would be accepted and being shown without cruelty that your assumption was wrong. What it most resembled, she decided after a while, was disorientation. The sense of reaching for a railing that wasn't there. Vivian had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs and still come up short at the end of every month. She knew what financial pressure looked like from the inside. She knew what it felt like to count things that shouldn't have to be counted. And the man who had just walked out of this lobby had that same particular quality of exhaustion in his face, the kind that doesn't come from one bad night, but from years of not quite catching up. He needed that money. She was certain of it. And he had handed it back without drama, without negotiation, without even a flicker of calculation in his expression. She had spent the last decade believing that everyone had a number, that if you found the right figure and said it clearly, the transaction would complete. It was not a cruel belief. It was simply she had always thought an accurate one. She put the envelope in her bag and drove back to Chicago. But she kept thinking about his face, not his words, the face itself, and the specific quality of the look he gave her just before he pushed the envelope back. It was not righteous. It was not proud. It was almost tired in the way that a person looks when they have made the same decision so many times that it no longer costs them the same amount to make it. As if honesty for him was not a performance. It was just what was left when everything else was stripped away. For a woman who had spent years believing that character was negotiable, that was the part she couldn't quite put down. Back in Chicago, Vivian's life resumed exactly as it always did. Meetings stacked on top of meetings, acquisition reviews, legal calls, a dinner with 3 investors who all wanted the same thing and would spend 2 hours pretending they didn't. Her assistant, a precise young woman named Dana, had learned years ago not to ask how the annual drive had gone. Vivian would answer with something short and return to work within the hour, and that was the end of it. This time was no different, except that it wasn't. The problem was not that she couldn't stop thinking about Owen Carter. The problem was that she couldn't figure out why she couldn't stop thinking about him. She had met generous people before. She had encountered honest people. She had written checks to charitable foundations run by people who genuinely cared about the work, and she had sat across from whistleblowers and nonprofit directors and public defenders who had all in their own way chosen principle over convenience. None of them had stayed with her the way this did. None of them had made her feel quite so off balance by doing something so ordinary. What bothered her, she finally admitted to herself on the 4th day, was the absence of performance. Every honest person she had ever dealt with in a professional context knew they were being honest in front of someone. There was always an audience, always a reputation at stake, always something downstream that the honesty was quietly building toward. But Owen had returned the wallet in the early morning hours to a hotel lobby where no one knew him in a town that wasn't his, with no witnesses who mattered and no record of his name attached to any of it. He could have kept everything and walked away clean. Instead, he drove 40 miles after a full overnight shift and handed back money that his life clearly needed. She found herself going over the math of his situation, the way she went over financial projections, looking for the angle, the hidden incentive, the variable she was missing. She found nothing. And the absence of a motive was more unsettling to her than any motive would have been. Owen, for his part, was not thinking about Vivian Sinclair. He was thinking about his electric bill, which was now 32 days past due, and about the fact that the transmission on his car had started making a sound, that no transmission should make. He had looked up the cost of the repair, and then looked away from it the way a person looks away from something they can't afford to see clearly. He picked up an extra shift on Saturday to cover the gap, worked through a Sunday that he had originally planned to spend doing nothing, and by Monday he was behind on sleep, in the particular way that accumulates interest, not just tired, but the kind of tired that makes everything slightly harder than it should be. His co-worker at the station, a man named Pete, who had worked nights there for 11 years and considered himself an authority on most things, asked once why Owen hadn't just kept the wallet. Owen told him the short version that it wasn't his, and Pete made a sound that indicated he found this answer philosophically insufficient. Owen didn't push back. He had stopped trying to explain certain things to certain people. Some decisions didn't have explanations that fit inside a normal conversation. They just were what they were. He did his shift, drove home, paid what he could pay, and let the rest sit in the pile. He was used to the pile. The pile was just another part of the structure of his life, the way a bad knee is just part of the structure of a body, something you compensate for without thinking about it anymore. 3 weeks after the hotel lobby, Vivian drove back to the gas station. She told Dana she had a site visit near the Tennessee border, which was not entirely false. She did own a small parcel of commercial land, about 60 miles from the station, that she had been meaning to evaluate in person for 2 quarters. But she timed the drive, carefully arriving at the station on a weekday morning when the lot was quiet, and the man behind the counter was Owen. He looked up when she came through the door. He recognized her immediately, but his expression did not shift the way most people's did when Vivian Sinclair walked into a room. He didn't straighten up. He didn't smile wider. He just looked at her, the way you look at someone you were not expecting to see, with the simple neutral fact of recognition. She bought a coffee from the machine near the door, which was terrible, and she stood at the counter and told him she wanted to ask him something. He said that was fine. She had not planned what she was going to say, with the precision she usually brought to difficult conversations. What came out was something closer to honest than strategic, which was not her usual mode, but felt in this particular context like the only register that would work. She told him she had looked him up. She said it plainly without apology. She was a person who gathered information before making decisions, and she had used the resources available to her to learn what she could about the man who had returned her wallet. She knew he had started a degree in accounting and finance at a state university and left before completing it. She knew roughly when and roughly why. She was not there to discuss the specifics unless he wanted to. She was there because she had a proposal. Owen set down the pen he was holding and looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was clearly prepared to become something close to it. Vivian told him she wanted to sponsor his CPA certification, cover the exam fees, the prep materials, the study time. And when he had the credential, she wanted to offer him a position in her company's financial review division. Entry-level, structured, with a clear path based entirely on performance. She said this the way she said most things, directly, without softening the edges. But she added one thing she didn't usually add. She told him she wasn't doing it to balance a ledger. She was doing it because she had spent 3 weeks trying to think of a single other person in her life who had made the choice he made, and she couldn't come up with one. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he told her no. He said it without anger, which somehow made it land harder. He told her he had no interest in becoming someone's project. He had made the decision he made because it was the right decision, not because he was looking for a return on it. He didn't want the certification paid for by someone who felt responsible for him, and he didn't want to spend the next several years in a position where he could never be entirely sure whether he had earned the thing or been given it. Vivian nodded. She drank the rest of her terrible coffee, thanked him for his time, and left. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 6 minutes, she knew, because she watched the clock, and then she drove back to Chicago. She came back again 2 weeks later. This time, she didn't offer him anything. She bought a coffee, sat at the small table near the window that was mostly used for people waiting out the rain, and told him she had a question that had nothing to do with a job offer. She asked him what had made him decide to study accounting in the first place before everything else happened. He looked at her for a moment, as if assessing whether that was true, and then he told her. He talked for about 20 minutes more than she expected. He talked about how numbers had always felt honest to him in a way that a lot of other things didn't, that a balance sheet couldn't lie to you the way a person could, that if something didn't add up, the problem was always findable if you looked carefully enough. He talked about the particular satisfaction of finding the error, correcting it, and watching the columns reconcile. There was something in the way he described it that was almost affectionate, the way a person talks about something they loved and then lost and haven't talked about in a long time. Vivian listened without redirecting, which was not something she did often. By the time his shift supervisor came through the back door and the conversation naturally wound down, something had shifted between them, not dramatically, not the way it shifts in stories, but in the quiet way that things shift when two people have actually listened to each other. Owen accepted the proposal 4 days later. He called the number on the card she had left on the table and told her he would try it under one condition, that his performance would be measured by the same standard as anyone else in the building. No separate track, no protected position. If he didn't earn it, he didn't keep it. Vivian agreed without hesitation. The first weeks inside Sinclair Group were not easy for Owen. The office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and everything about it, the badge, access, the standing desks, the catered lunches that appeared and disappeared without anyone commenting on them, made him feel the gap between his previous life and this one in a way that was almost physical. He made mistakes that a person with more experience in corporate environments would not have made. He sent emails to the wrong distribution lists. He used terminology incorrectly in 2 different meetings before someone bothered to correct him. He learned the landscape the way anyone learns a foreign country slowly, by making errors and adjusting. What he had not anticipated was how quickly certain people would decide what he was. Within his first 2 weeks, the story had moved through the office in the way that stories do not loudly, but thoroughly. By the end of the month, he had overheard the phrase, "the cashier she felt sorry for," in 2 separate conversations that were not intended for him. The people who said it weren't cruel exactly. They were simply performing the specific social calculus that organizations run on, figuring out where someone fit what they were worth, whether they were a variable that needed to be accounted for or one that could be safely ignored. Owen said nothing. He came in early, stayed late, and worked through the CPA prep materials every night at the kitchen table in a way that left him running on 5 hours of sleep more often than not. He was not trying to prove something to the people who had dismissed him. He was trying to prove something to himself, that he had not accepted this opportunity out of weakness, out of desperation, out of a willingness to be indebted. That he was here because he could do the work. What Owen did not know, because he was not looking in that direction, was that Vivian was having her own reckoning. She watched him from the kind of distance that executive positions naturally create, through reports and second-hand observations and the occasional meeting where she could assess his work directly. What she saw was competent and careful and getting sharper by the week. But that wasn't what occupied her. What occupied her was the growing and uncomfortable awareness of what her own days actually contained. She had the building, she had the revenue, she had a portfolio that financial journalists used as a benchmark when they wrote about aggressive growth. She had all of the evidence, in other words, that she had won by every measure she had ever set for herself. And she came home every night to a penthouse that had been professionally decorated and was perfectly maintained, and felt in the most precise sense of the word, unoccupied. Not empty, there were things in it, good things, expensive things. But there was no residue of living in it, the way there is residue in a place where someone is actually present. It looked the way a hotel room looks when the cleaning staff has just finished, correct and impersonal and ready for whoever comes next. One evening she came home from a dinner where she had been seated between two executives she had known for years, and realized somewhere between the second and third course that she did not actually know a single true thing about either of them. She knew their professional histories, their deal structures, their preferred negotiating tactics. She knew nothing else. And more troublingly, they knew nothing else about her because she had never allowed it, had in fact structured her entire professional life around preventing it. She sat for a long time at her kitchen table that night and understood that she had built herself a very expensive kind of loneliness and had spent 15 years calling it independence. Owen's resignation letter arrived on Donna's desk on a Thursday morning. He had written it cleanly, 2 paragraphs, professional, no grievances listed. He cited a mismatch with the company culture, which was the polite way of saying that he had heard the phrase charity case once too many times, and had decided that his self-respect was not something he was willing to negotiate with, even for a salary that was more than 3 times what he had made at the station. He had left the offer open for exactly as long as his pride could hold, and it turned out that his pride had a definite timeline. Dana brought the letter to Vivian without comment, set it on the corner of her desk, and left the room. Vivian read it once, set it down, and looked out the window at the city for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Vivian did not call Owen's cell phone. She called the front desk of the gas station, the main line listed on the station's website, the kind of number that rang a wall-mounted phone somewhere near the register. She asked the person who answered if Owen Carter was scheduled to work that day. The person said he wasn't. She asked when his next shift was. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that meant the person was deciding whether this was any of their business to share. And then they said tomorrow morning, 6 to 2. She drove down the next day. She arrived at the station at 10 in the morning, which gave her enough time to have thought clearly about what she wanted to say, and not enough time to have talked herself into saying something more careful instead. Owen was behind the counter when she came through the door. He looked at her with an expression that was resigned, without being unfriendly, the look of a person who had been expecting a conversation and was ready to have it over with. Vivian did not buy a coffee this time. She stood at the counter and told him she had read his resignation letter and that she was not there to argue with his decision. She said she understood why he had made it and that she thought his reasoning was sound. Then she told him that the people who had called him a charity case were wrong, that she knew they were wrong, that she had known for weeks, and that she had failed to make that clear in a way that actually protected him from having to absorb it. She said this without looking away from him, because she had decided on the drive down that if she was going to say it at all, she was going to say it directly. Owen listened with his arms crossed, and his weight shifted slightly back, the posture of a person who is genuinely listening, but is not yet ready to move. He asked her what she wanted from him. It was a fair question, and she answered it honestly. She wanted him to come back, but not to the position she had offered before. She wanted to propose something different. Before she laid out the new proposal, she told him something she had not said to anyone. She told him about the board meeting she had called 2 days after receiving his resignation. Not the quarterly review, but a separate session she had convened specifically to address what had been said about Owen inside her organization. She had stood at the head of the table and told her senior team plainly that the characterization of Owen Carter as a charity case was inaccurate, that his work in the financial review division had been solid, and that the culture that produced that kind of language was one she intended to change. She said it without drama and without naming individuals, which was a more effective way of making sure everyone in the room understood they were being addressed personally. The room had been very quiet. Owen looked at her for a long moment after she said this. She could see something shifting in his expression. Not gratitude, exactly, but a recalibration. The posture with the crossed arms loosened slightly. He didn't say anything immediately, which she had learned over the past several months meant he was taking something seriously. Then she told him about the new proposal. The idea had come to her at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, 3 nights after she received his resignation letter. She had been sitting with the financial reports from her last quarter and thinking, as she sometimes did at that hour, about her mother, about the 2 jobs and the short months, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working hard, but from working hard inside a system that isn't designed to let you catch up. She had been thinking about how many people she had known growing up who were not struggling because they lacked intelligence or work ethic, but because they had never had access to anyone who could show them how money actually moved, how debt accumulated, where the traps were, how to read a contract before signing it. She had been sitting there thinking about all of this when she realized that Owen had the skills, the background, and more importantly, the specific kind of credibility that came from having actually lived inside that system. She thought about what it would mean to have someone like that in a room with people who were currently drowning, the way he had been drowning, not as a counselor or a sympathetic ear, but as someone who could actually read the numbers and show them where the floor was. The proposal she brought to him at the station counter that morning was this: a joint venture structured as a non-profit financial advisory office, funded initially by Sinclair Group, but operated independently. Its purpose would be to provide free financial consultation to working adults, navigating medical debt, predatory loan agreements, and wage garnishment, the specific categories of financial crisis that destroyed people, not because the problems were unsolvable, but because the people inside them couldn't afford the expertise to solve them. Owen would run the advisory side. Vivian would handle the funding structure and the legal framework. Neither of them would have authority over the other's domain. Owen looked at the counter for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. He asked why she needed him specifically, whether she couldn't simply hire a team of certified advisors and point them at the problem. She told him she could, and that she had considered it, but that a room full of people who had only ever known the system from the outside would produce something that felt exactly like what it was. Charity delivered from a distance. She told him that what she wanted to build required someone who understood the problem from the inside, and that she had not met another person who fit that description, and who she also trusted to run it honestly. It was the last part that landed. She could see it in the way something shifted in his face, not softened exactly, but changed. He asked her if she meant the trust part, or if she was saying it because it was the right thing to say. She told him she meant it, and that she was aware there wasn't a way for her to prove that in advance, and that she understood if that wasn't enough. Owen said he would think about it. She left him her number again, even though he still had the card from the last time, and drove back to Chicago. He called her 4 days later. He said yes under the same condition as before, that his role would be evaluated on outcomes, not on the basis of their arrangement. If the office wasn't helping people in a measurable way within 18 months, he would walk away, and they would both accept that it hadn't worked. She agreed. They had their first working meeting the following week at a coffee shop that was equidistant between the gas station and the city, which was Owen's suggestion and which Vivian accepted without comment. The early months were not smooth. Building the advisory office required navigating a set of legal and structural questions that were genuinely complicated, and Owen and Vivian disagreed on several of them in ways that were direct and occasionally uncomfortable. He pushed back on her instinct to scale quickly, arguing that if they expanded before the model was working reliably, they would end up with something large and ineffective. She pushed back on his instinct to move slowly, arguing that every month they spent fine-tuning was a month that people in crisis were going without help. They argued about this more than once in meetings that ran past their scheduled end time and left both of them frustrated in the way that productive disagreement leaves people frustrated, not angry, but unresolved in a way that kept the conversation going. What emerged from those arguments was something better than either of them had proposed individually. The office opened in a mid-sized building in a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, not a satellite of Sinclair Group, not branded with her name, not designed to look like a corporate initiative that had been pointed at a social problem. It looked like what it was, a functional place where people could come and sit across from someone who would read their paperwork with them and tell them the truth about what it said. Within the first 6 months, Owen had worked through cases involving wage garnishment, predatory payday loan structures, and medical billing disputes for over 200 individuals. He had brought in 2 additional advisors, both of whom had backgrounds similar to his people who had spent years inside the system they were now helping others navigate. Vivian watched the numbers and said little. She had learned in the process of building this thing alongside him that there was a particular kind of trust that came not from a single gesture, but from the accumulation of small, consistent decisions over time. She had watched him make those decisions, the way he handled difficult clients, the way he held the line on what the office could and couldn't promise, the way he dealt with cases that had no clean resolution, and she had revised her understanding of him upward in a way that she rarely did for anyone. The shift in their relationship was not dramatic. There was no single moment she could point to. It was more like the way a photograph develops slowly, with the image becoming clearer, not because something new was added, but because what was already there became visible. They had started as 2 people on opposite sides of a transaction. They had become somewhere in the middle of arguments about expansion models and 18-month evaluations, something closer to collaborators. And somewhere after that, after enough late meetings and honest disagreements, and the particular intimacy of building something real together, they had become something that neither of them had a clean word for, but that both of them had stopped pretending wasn't there. Vivian did not announce this to anyone. Owen did not announce it either. They simply continued showing up, which was she had come to understand what trust actually looked like when it wasn't performing. The day Sinclair Group's quarterly board meeting discussed the advisory office for the first time. As a line item, one of the senior directors, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had been on the board for 9 years and had strong opinions about brand dilution, asked Vivian to explain the strategic rationale for the venture. He used the word optics twice in the same sentence, which was his way of asking whether this was good for the company's image, without wanting to be recorded saying so directly. Vivian told him the strategic rationale was that it worked. She pulled up the outcome data from the first 2 quarters. The number of cases resolved, the average reduction in client debt, burdened the secondary economic impact of keeping people in housing and employment, who would otherwise have lost both. She presented it the way she presented everything, with numbers, clearly without apology. And then she said something she had not planned to say in a board meeting, which was that she had spent 15 years building things designed to grow, and that the advisory office was the first thing she had built that she was genuinely proud of, and that she intended to keep funding it regardless of how it reflected on the brand. Gerald Marsh had no follow-up question. The item passed. A year after the wallet, Vivian made the annual drive south again. Same rented sedan, same highway, same particular silence. She visited the grave and sat for a while the way she always did. She did not time the visit. She did not check her phone. She simply sat until she was ready to leave, which took longer than it used to, and she thought that was probably a good sign. On the way back, she stopped at the gas station. It was different inside now. A young man she didn't recognize was working the counter, probably in his early 20s, with a textbook open on the stool behind the register, the kind of thick, spiral-bound study guide that exam prep courses produced. He looked up when she came in, rang up her water and crackers, with the efficiency of someone who had done it enough times that it no longer required full attention, and looked back down at his book before she had finished putting her change away. Vivian stood at the counter for a moment. The young man glanced up again, uncertain whether she needed something else. She told him she didn't mean to interrupt. She said she had stopped at this station once before, a while back, and that the person working that night had made a decision that changed the direction of several things she cared about, and that she had wanted to come back. The young man nodded in the way people nod when they're not entirely sure what to do with what they're being told. Vivian looked at the textbook. She asked what he was studying. He said accounting. She told him that was a good thing to be studying, and that the work was worth finishing, even when it took longer than expected, and that some paths were long, but that the length of them was not a reason to stop. She said it plainly the way she said most things, without dressing it up. He nodded again, and this time, it was the nod of someone who had actually heard something. She walked out into the cold air. Owen was leaning against the passenger side of his car, not the old rusted sedan with the cracked taillight, but the same make and model several years newer, maintained to the point of reliability. He had insisted on buying it himself, which had taken him the better part of 8 months, and which Vivian had not commented on, because she understood that some things needed to be done a certain way, or they didn't mean what they were supposed to mean. She got into the driver's side without saying anything. Owen got in. The highway stretched out ahead of them flat and long, and lit by a sky that was just beginning to go dark at the edges. Neither of them said anything for a while, which was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have run out of things to prove to each other. The wallet that had started all of this was still in her bag. She had never replaced it with a newer one, which was the kind of detail that said something she had never said out loud. Inside was the photograph, the woman and the girl standing in the sun, looking at each other instead of the camera. It was worn at the edges in the same places it had always been worn. Nothing inside had changed, but the person carrying it had.